A fuse hisses in the dark for about 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, a pirate crew decides who lives. Not the cutlass, not the flintlock pistol. A hollow iron ball, the size of an orange, packed with black powder, thrown by hand across 10 feet of open deck. Every pirate film ever made sells you the same lie. 2 crews meet in the middle of the ocean, blades come out, and the fight is won by whoever swings harder. That is Hollywood. That is not how a real boarding action worked in the golden age of piracy. Before a single cutlass ever left its scabbard, the deck of the target ship had already been turned into a controlled disaster zone by a weapon most people watching pirate movies have never even heard of. In 1796, no, long before that, in the final years of the 1600s and running through the early 1700s, sailors called them granados. We call them grenades. And they were not a rare novelty carried by 1 or 2 specialists. According to the archaeological record recovered from the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's own flagship, divers pulled up nearly a dozen of these devices from a single mass of corroded metal fused together on the ocean floor. Cannon get the glory in every documentary. Cutlasses get the merchandise. But the grenade is the piece of pirate engineering that nobody talks about. It may be the single most important weapon standing between a pirate crew and a bloodbath they could not win. Here is the contradiction this video is going to sit with for the next half hour. Pirates are remembered as reckless men who solved every problem with a blade and a bottle of rum. But the object at the center of today's story required patience, precise timing, and an almost engineering-grade understanding of fire, metal, and human panic. Get the timing wrong by even a second or two, and the device meant for the enemy deck could just as easily take off the fingers of the man who lit it. This was not brute force. This was applied chemistry wrapped around psychological warfare. It was thrown by hand across open water onto a deck full of men who had absolutely no idea what was about to land at their feet. So how did a simple clay or glass or cast iron shell become one of the most feared objects on the high seas? Why did navies eventually train entire units of soldiers whose only job was throwing these things? And what does the wreck of Blackbeard's own ship tell us about how often these devices actually worked the way they were supposed to? By the end of this video, you will understand why the real weapon that decided most pirate boardings was never the sword raised above a man's head. It was the object already burning in his other hand. Nassau, the lawless pirate harbor that briefly terrified the entire British Empire, ran on this same principle long before any single captain became famous for it. It survived for years as a pirate republic, with no formal army and no fortified walls. Its residents could not have outfought the Royal Navy in open combat. What kept the harbor safe instead was reputation. The same reputation attached to weapons like this one, which made most captains surrender before a shot was ever fired in anger. Let us start with the sound survivors described most often. Not a scream, not a cannon roar, but a short, hollow thud, followed by a strange, silent pause. That pause told an experienced sailor exactly what was coming next, and exactly how many seconds he had left to get away from it. Merchant crews who lived through a pirate boarding rarely wrote long accounts of the swordplay, because for most of them, there was almost none. What they remembered instead was the smoke, the sudden burst of choking sulfur fumes rolling across the planking, and the sight of grown men diving below deck to escape an object they could not even clearly see. That single detail should already tell you something important about how these engagements actually worked. A ship's captain facing this situation had seconds, not minutes, to decide whether his crew would fight, surrender, or simply scatter. And in almost every documented case, The decision was already made for him before he even reached for his own weapon. A pirate crew rarely wanted a long fight. Killing the crew of a merchant vessel destroyed the very thing pirates were there to steal: the ship, the cargo, and the labor of men who might be persuaded to join the crew rather than die for a wage they were never paid fairly in the first place. What pirates needed was submission. Fast, total, and terrifying enough that nobody reached for a weapon of their own. A well-thrown grenade did that job in under 10 seconds, and it did it without a single cannon shot putting a hole below the waterline of a ship the pirates still intended to sail away in. To understand where this weapon came from, we have to leave pirates out of the story completely for a moment, because pirates did not invent the grenade, and they were never the ones pushing the technology forward. Historical records place the earliest hand-thrown explosive shells in European siege warfare more than a century before the golden age of piracy even began, used to clear defenders off fortress walls before soldiers climbed over with ladders. The very word grenade comes from the French word for pomegranate, because the fruit, packed with small seeds inside a tough, rounded skin, looked uncomfortably similar to an iron shell packed with gunpowder and ready to burst apart into fragments. By the mid-1600s, several European armies had gone further and created entire specialist units built around this single weapon. Soldiers trained specifically to carry and throw these devices earned their own name, grenadiers. And the position demanded a steady hand, real physical strength, and the nerve to stand closer to an active fuse than almost anyone else on a battlefield wanted to be. Historical military records show the English army formalized this specialization in the year 1678, when a company of grenadiers was ordered added to each of the senior regiments of foot, men chosen specifically for their height and strength, because a grenade thrown a few feet short of its target could kill the thrower just as easily as the enemy. This detail matters for our story because it places the golden age of piracy squarely inside the same decades when European militaries were actively expanding their use of this exact weapon. Which means the pirates who later carried grenades onto their own ships were not working from rumor or guesswork. They were working from direct personal experience gained in the very navies and armies that trained them before they ever raised a black flag. This is the fact versus myth moment worth pausing on. The myth is that pirates were isolated outlaws, improvising crude weapons out of desperation. The reality, documented in period accounts, is closer to the opposite. Pirates were often former Navy gunners, former privateers, and former merchant sailors who had already served on ships equipped with standard military hardware. And they carried that training directly into their new, considerably less legal careers. When a pirate crew stocked grenades in their arms locker, they were not inventing something crude and new. They were repurposing a weapon that professional European militaries had already spent decades refining for exactly this kind of close-quarters chaos. It helps to slow down here for a moment, because the picture that emerges from surviving ship inventories is a fairly ordinary one. Quartermasters on pirate vessels kept lists of powder, shot, and arms much the same way any ship's officer did in any navy of the period. A routine bookkeeping task rather than anything dramatic, and grenades appear on those lists the same way cutlasses and muskets do, counted, stored, and issued as needed. According to accounts collected in period naval writing, including the detailed descriptions found in Bennerson Little's research on buccaneer combat practice, 3 separate categories of these hand-thrown explosives circulated through pirate and privateer arsenals by the late 1600s. One type relied on fire to destroy wooden structures outright. Another produced dense smoke to cover an advancing party from musket fire. And the third, the true grenade in the modern sense, was built purely to kill and maim through the force of the blast and the metal fragments it threw outward in every direction. A pirate quartermaster stocking a ship's arms locker was not choosing between these three options at random. He was thinking about exactly what kind of fight his crew was about to walk into, and matching the tool to the job with the same seriousness any tradesman would bring to choosing the right blade for a cut. The buccaneer companies operating out of ports like Port Royal and Tortuga in the decades before the classic Golden Age had already proven the tactical value of this weapon on land, using fire and smoke devices to storm Spanish coastal towns and fortified warehouses long before the more famous pirate captains of the 1710s and 1720s took the same techniques to sea. What changed was not the weapon itself, but the stage it was used on, a rolling wooden deck instead of a stone rampart, and an enemy crew instead of a garrison of soldiers. Spanish, Dutch, and French naval forces operating throughout the Caribbean during these same decades stocked similar devices aboard their own warships, which means that when a pirate crew captured an enemy vessel, they frequently captured its arms locker along with it, grenades included, adding freshly seized stock to whatever they already carried. This detail alone explains why grenades show up so consistently across pirate shipwrecks from different captains, different crews, and different years. They were not rare specialty items smuggled in from a single supplier. They were common naval hardware, constantly changing hands as ships themselves changed hands. So, what did a real pirate grenade actually look like, and how did it work? Surviving examples recovered from wreck sites, alongside detailed period descriptions, show two main forms circulating at the same time. The formal military version was a cast iron sphere, roughly the size of a large orange, its walls thick enough to hold pressure, but brittle enough to fracture into dozens of sharp fragments the instant the powder inside ignited. The improvised pirate version, and this is the detail that separates real history from the movie version, was frequently nothing more than a thick glass wine bottle. Pirates packed it with gunpowder, and then added metal scrap, lead shot, or broken nails, turning ordinary shipboard trash into flying shrapnel the moment the bottle shattered. Historians who have studied surviving 17th century examples describe the formal iron version as roughly the size of a cricket ball, a plain sphere with no markings, no safety mechanism, and nothing separating a controlled weapon from an uncontrolled accident except the length of cord burning down toward the powder inside. Both versions relied on the same weak point, the fuse. A length of slow-burning cord, soaked in a saltpeter solution to control its burn rate, was pushed into the neck of the shell or tied tightly around the outside. Lighting that fuse from an open flame or a smoldering slow match, then throwing the device accurately across a pitching, rolling deck in the middle of a fight required genuine skill and genuine nerve. Burned too long before the throw, and the man holding it lost fingers, a hand, sometimes his life. Throw too early, and the enemy crew had time to kick the still-burning device straight back across the deck toward the people who threw it in the first place. Now picture the actual sequence of a real boarding action, because it did not begin with blades at all. As a pirate vessel closed distance on its target, small swivel guns mounted along the rail, nicknamed murderers by the sailors who operated them, opened fire first, sweeping the open deck with lead shot to force defenders to take cover. Only then, at close range, often as the two hulls were grinding together, did the grenades come out, thrown in a tight arc onto the deck or through an open hatch into the crew quarters below. They detonated in the enclosed, smoke-filled chaos of a wooden ship, doing something no cutlass ever could. They broke the will of an entire crew in a matter of seconds, rather than requiring pirates to fight and possibly kill every single defender one at a time. The stinkpot deserves its own mention here, a close cousin to the grenade, built for an entirely different purpose. Instead of metal fragments, it was packed with sulfur and other foul-smelling, throat-burning compounds. When it burst, it produced no deadly shrapnel at all, only a choking, blinding cloud that made it nearly impossible for defenders below decks to keep fighting, breathing, or even see the men now climbing over their rail. Survivors who described the smell afterward compared it to rotten eggs mixed with burning pitch, a stench so overwhelming that men who had faced cannon fire without flinching reportedly abandoned their posts entirely rather than continue breathing it in. This is the part most pirate stories skip entirely. The goal was rarely to kill the crew of the ship being taken. A dead crew could not be recruited, questioned for information about better prizes further down the shipping lane, or forced to sail the very ship pirates had just captured. Fear, smoke, and confusion did the job that violence alone could never do as efficiently, emptying a deck of resistance while leaving the ship, the cargo, and as many of the men as possible intact and useful. There is a reason this specific weapon thrived at sea in a way it never fully did on open battlefields. On land, an unreliable fuse burning at an unpredictable rate was a serious liability across the wide open spaces of a formal battle line, giving alert defenders time to scatter or even throw the device back before it went off. On the deck of a ship, the equation flipped entirely. Space was cramped. Exits were few. Hatches led down into dark enclosed compartments with nowhere to run. And the sheer noise and smoke of an explosion in that confined wooden shell was amplified rather than dispersed. The same unpredictability that limited the grenade's usefulness in an open field became a weapon of concentrated terror the moment it was thrown onto 40 or 50 feet of crowded deck with nowhere left to go. Now, here is the twist, buried literally under 300 years of sand off the coast of North Carolina. In November of 1996, a private research firm located a shipwreck in the Beaufort Inlet that would eventually be identified, through years of careful archaeological work, as the Queen Anne's Revenge, Blackbeard's own flagship, lost in June of 1718. As archaeologists from the North Carolina Underwater Archaeology Branch worked through the wreck site over the following decades, they recovered a concretion, a single fused mass of corroded metal objects bonded together by centuries underwater, that contained nearly a dozen grenades, alongside navigational calipers and ceramic fragments. And reporting from the ongoing conservation project has described the wider site assemblage as including roughly 24 hand grenades in total, recovered piece by piece as excavation continued. Cannon and cutlasses tell an obvious story. A near-intact stockpile of unused grenades tells a stranger one. These devices, prepared, loaded, ready for a fight, went down with the ship still unused, still armed, still exactly as dangerous to Blackbeard's own crew as they would have been to any enemy. According to researchers who have studied siege-era grenades of the same period, the fuses on these devices were notoriously unreliable. So unreliable that historians studying the broader adoption of the weapon across European militaries note it saw far more use in sieges against fixed fortifications than in fast-moving infantry battles, precisely because a fuse that burned too fast, too slow, or not at all, could turn the weapon against the very men using it. The official conservation project overseeing the wreck describes the construction in specific terms: a hollow iron sphere sealed with a wooden plug fitted into the opening, through which a slow-burning match or a paper fuse was threaded before the device was lit and thrown. That same project notes plainly that a fuse cut too long gave the intended target enough time to snatch up the still-burning sphere and throw it straight back at the men who had just thrown it at him, turning an offensive weapon into a returned death sentence in the space of a single breath. That unreliability is the twist most pirate documentaries never mention. The grenade that could shatter a deck full of defenders in an instant was, by its own design, nearly as dangerous to the crew holding it as to the crew it was thrown at. And yet, the fear it inspired did not depend on it working perfectly every single time. It depended on the enemy crew believing it might. There is one especially vivid documented case worth walking through in detail. According to a report sent by the governor of Jamaica to the Council of Trade and Plantations, dated the 31st of January, 1719, a pirate captain named Thompson used exactly this kind of engagement to defeat 2 vessels sent specifically to hunt him down near Port Royal. By this point in the record, pirate hunting had become official colonial policy, with governors across the Caribbean commissioning armed sloops specifically to track down and capture men like Thompson, whose continued raiding threatened the shipping lanes that colonial economies depended on. The account describes one of the vessels involved raising a black flag as the ships closed the distance between them, followed by an engagement in which Thompson's crew relied on the same close-range tactics this video has just walked through: grenades and small arms fire used to break the resolve of trained pirate hunters before a full boarding could even take place. The governor's report treats the outcome as a genuine setback for colonial authority, proof that even purpose-built pursuit vessels, crewed by men specifically tasked with ending piracy in the region, could be turned back by the same close-quarters chaos that pirates had already been using against merchant crews for years. This was not a rare, isolated tale passed down through legend. It was formal colonial correspondence written by a government official reporting a real military failure to his superiors, which tells you plainly how seriously the authorities of the time took a weapon modern pop culture has almost completely forgotten. Every man assigned to throw one of these devices during a boarding accepted a personal risk that no cutlass ever demanded of him. Standing exposed on a moving deck, cradling a lit fuse burning down toward a fistful of gunpowder inches from his own chest, he had perhaps 3 or 4 seconds to judge the throw correctly. A window so narrow that period military instructors specifically recruited the tallest, strongest, steadiest men available for the role, precisely because a short throw or a slow release could turn a boarding tactic into a self-inflicted disaster in front of his entire crew. Today, the recovered grenades from the Queen Anne's Revenge sit in a conservation lab in Greenville, North Carolina, where researchers periodically open the facility to the public specifically to explain finds like this one, a rare case where a weapon designed to disappear in a flash of fire and smoke instead survived, fully intact, long enough to be studied in careful, patient detail, centuries after the men who packed it were gone. So what do we actually take from an unused grenade sitting quietly in a museum conservation lab in Greenville, North Carolina, 300 years after it should have exploded? It tells us something that goes far beyond pirate history, something that shows up again and again wherever humans have engineered tools meant to project fear rather than simply cause harm. The most effective weapon in Blackbeard's arsenal was never really the iron and gunpowder at all. It was the uncertainty that iron and gunpowder created in the mind of every sailor watching it arc through the air toward him. A cannon announces exactly what it can do the moment it fires. A grenade, thrown by hand, lit by an unpredictable fuse, tumbling end over end across a rolling deck, kept its victims guessing about the one variable that mattered most: timing. That single unknown, how many seconds are left before this goes off, did more to end a fight before it began than any blade ever could. History is full of quieter versions of this same principle, long before gunpowder ever existed. Ancient siege commanders learned that the sound of a battering ram against a gate could break the morale of a garrison faster than the ram itself ever needed to. Medieval fortress builders discovered that a visible row of spikes below a wall often stopped an attack that spikes alone, hidden and unseen, never could have stopped. Golden Age pirates simply found their own version of that very old lesson, wrapped in iron, gunpowder, and a burning length of cord, and carried it onto the deck of a stolen ship in the middle of the ocean. There is something almost uncomfortable in recognizing that the pirates we picture as reckless brawlers were, in this one narrow and specific sense, closer to engineers than to swordsmen. Men who understood that controlling fear was cheaper, faster, and far less costly in blood than controlling a battlefield by force alone. That idea did not end with the golden age of piracy, and it did not stay confined to wooden ships and powder-soaked fuses. Every generation since has built its own version of the same lesson, a tool whose greatest power lies not in what it does, but in what the person facing it believes it might do. Somewhere off the coast of North Carolina, sealed inside a block of corroded metal that took archaeologists years to carefully take apart, sit grenades that never got the chance to prove that theory one way or the other. We will never know for certain whether they were held back out of caution, lost in the chaos of a sinking ship, or simply never needed because the mere sight of a lit fuse in a pirate's hand was already enough to end the fight before it started. Every historical mystery like this one eventually forces the same choice on the people studying it. Either accept the comfortable version where every weapon works exactly as designed every single time, or accept the messier, more honest version, where fear did at least as much of the fighting as fire and metal ever did. Standing in front of a case of corroded iron spheres in a quiet conservation lab, it is easy to forget that each one once represented 3 or 4 seconds of complete uncertainty for the men standing closest to it, pirate and target alike. An uncertainty that could just as easily have ended the life of the man holding it as the life of the man it was thrown at. And maybe that unanswered question is the most honest ending this story can have. Because the most dangerous weapons in history are rarely the ones we can fully explain. They are the ones that still leave us wondering, 300 years later, exactly how close they really came to going off.